Welcome to the digital format of Too Much Truth, where we get an opportunity to talk to newsmakers, opinion leaders, and people out front. And we're honored today to be joined by Alexis Scott. Alexis, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you doing?
It's good to see you.
Appreciate the invitation to join you.
History maker.
Yeah.
The Scott family.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about that as we run up to what we really want to talk about, the assassination of Dr. King and all the activity that happened in Atlanta around that. Mm-hmm. But we can't talk about Atlanta without talking about your family. Okay. The founding of the Atlanta Daily World, the first daily black-owned newspaper in the United States, and your grandfather, W.A. Scott, founds the second, founds the paper. Tell us about who W.A. Scott II was.
Okay, I can tell you only about what I've read and heard about him because he was killed in 1934. I wasn't born then, so I have read about him, but apparently he was a fairly gifted and phenomenal person. He was 26 when he started the paper. It started as a weekly. He started it, then went to 2 days a week, and then 3 days a week. And he was talking to some business people of what he should do, and they suggested he should go ahead and make it a daily. He could make a lot more money, they suggested. At the time, he was publishing 3 days a week, and he wanted to get a real editor who had experience to help him make it a daily. So that at the time, in 1930s, the headquarters of Negro journalism was in Chicago, where the Defender had been publishing since 1905. And it was also the headquarters of the Associated Negro Press, which was the conglomerate that did news gathering for all of the black papers around the country. So he drove to Chicago, and he talked to people who he should see, and they told him to get Frank Marshall Davis. Frank had been at the Associated Negro Press. He had also been an editor at the time at a newspaper in Gary. So he drove over to Gary and he found him. Frank had never been south. He'd grown up in Kansas. He studied journalism in Kansas State. And he didn't want to come south. But my grandfather apparently was so persuasive and also offered him $25 a week. He was making $15, and he promised him he'd give him $35 a week if things went well. And so he said, okay, he was tempted. And this was in 1930.
Wow.
So this was sort of the height of the Depression. But the newspaper had been doing pretty well. At the time, my grandfather was publishing the Atlanta World, the Birmingham World, and the Memphis World. And so he was being pretty successful. And he was trying to get newspapers around the country to use his printing services. And that was a brilliant stroke, too, because he became like a service bureau for the black press. And he got people to start their papers. He'd print them, send them COD, and then they would be successful, right? And he told them how to make the newspaper successful by putting babies and pretty women on the front page.
Wow.
And lots of church news. And so that was the kind of the format for the news coverage. Because, of course, these things were not covered in the majority media at the time. White press didn't have any good news about black people per se, let alone church or babies or pretty women. And pretty black women at that. So anyway, that was sort of his formula for getting the paper off the ground, and it worked. But he really wanted a serious, well-trained editor to help him launch the daily. And so Frank came south, and he and my grandfather apparently got along very well. And the way I found out about this story is that Frank's own memoir was published posthumously in 1987 after he died, and it's a whole chapter dedicated to his time in Atlanta. So I was very grateful to find out about that. And there's another sidebar story that I could tell you about how I found out about that later. But in any case, Frank came, and together they launched the paper, and it became a daily in March of 1932.
Wow.
And it was a very successful enterprise until 1934, when my grandfather was killed. He was shot in the back as he was going into his house on Ashby, which is now Lowry, and Spencer. His house was right there on the corner. The house is still there. So he was shot. He lived for a week, but he never regained, full health. My father said that had they had better technology and science, he would have survived, but he got peritonitis or something from the gunshot wound into his intestines or something.
Talk about from his death,
Okay,
the paper transitions to whom?
To his brother. My dad was a little boy at the time. My dad was 11 years old, and C.A. Scott took over. You may have met him.
Yes.
He was there for 63 years as the editor and general manager. And he was a younger brother. He was 26 when he took over. I have a great deal more sympathy for C.A. than I did before I went to take over the paper myself, because it's quite a task, and he was really in a hard place because he had to step in the middle of this family crisis and take over. But he did, and he kept it going. And the paper continued to publish on a daily basis for up until the 70s. And then they shut the presses down because they got too old and broke down, and technology was changing so much. And C.A. was, I guess, a child of the Depression. He didn't want to go into debt, so he wasn't going to spend $500,000 to get printing presses. So he didn't do it, and they contracted for printing after that and reduced the publication back to 3 days a week. And by the time I took over, it was down to 2 days a week. And we kept it there for a while, but then we went to 1 day a week. The universe just wasn't there for a small publication to publish more than once a week.
Talk about the heyday, the stories you've heard about what the booming, whether it was, we literally could look at the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s.
Right.
For the paper, what was the booming days
Well, I would say
recall?
they recovered from the tragedy and continued to publish. Frank left about a year or two later. He went back to Chicago to work. And I got an interesting story about Frank that I just learned recently, too. When he went back to Chicago, while I was in Atlanta, he started writing poetry as well as the journalism. He continued to write poetry, and he joined a writing group with Frank Yerby, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Gwendolyn Brooks, amazing writers who went on to become known as the Harlem Renaissance writers. And there was also a young white woman in the group, Helen Caldwell. She was 18 years Frank's junior, but they struck up a relationship and ended up getting married. And they stayed in Chicago through World War II. But the racism and the stress of an interracial marriage in supposedly not racist Chicago, but as we all know, Chicago was just as bad as being in the South, except they just had a little bit more going for them, and it was more subtle. Racism was more subtle. In any case, she convinced him that they should leave the United States, and they would go someplace where they wouldn't be so noticeable, or they could live more freely. And so she convinced him to go to Hawaii, which at the time was not a part of the United States. And there, Frank met a white World War II veteran who had a black grandson who had been abandoned by his father. And he was to see him. He'd take him over to talk and visit with Frank. And that black kid grew up to be the 44th president of the United States.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
A lot of history.
And you never know what's going to come out of one tragedy, or what incident will, cause something else to happen. So that was an interesting story that I learned just from reading the book about Obama's election. It's called Renegade by Richard Wolff. And in that book, he mentioned him visiting with this journalist named Frank Marshall Davis. And I said, that's familiar to me.
Wow.
And I went back and looked it up. So that was quite a story. But on to the Atlanta World. It continued to prosper and grow, again, being the only game in town. And it was like akin to Twitter, Facebook, CNN, if you will, to say that kind of innovation for communications in the black community, because it was a daily thing. And nobody else had done that before, so that they could keep up and they could say, today we're going to have this town hall meeting, today this is going on at Spelman, this is going on at Morehouse, so that people could just immediately get the news about what was going to happen before it happened, and then get the coverage right after it happened. So it was really innovative for the time, and wonderful for bringing the community together. And the other thing that happened in the 40s, the newspaper got the first black correspondent for covering the president in the Congress. The credential had to be a daily credential in order to get admission to Congress and the White House. And so the Atlanta World joined forces with the then National Newspapers Publishers Association. I think it was called the National Negro Publishers Association at the time. And they pooled their resources together and helped finance this correspondent. and he was hired, I think, in 1944, but he was an Atlanta Daily World reporter to cover the White House and the Congress. So that was another big push forward for the black press.
Let's talk about, obviously in Atlanta, it is the birth home of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King in the NCLC office on Auburn Avenue, Atlanta Daily World down in the same Auburn Avenue.
Right.
Let's talk about your coming of age in the 60s and you being a part. When did you know that your family was chronicling what is probably one of the most important epics of history from right on Auburn Avenue and having access to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement the way that you did?
Well, I knew early on that the newspaper was chronicling our community's history because back in the day when I was a little bitty kid, Black History Week, as it was called then, was a big time for Atlanta because a lot of the Black history makers were Atlanta people who were businessmen and others, civil rights people. So I knew that was something that we were covering that other people were not. And I also know that my great-uncle C.A., who took over the paper, was a contemporary of Daddy King. And so, and his thought was that the way to break down these barriers was to go through the court system. So he was not in favor of the street movement that developed in the 60s. And he was concerned because he also had two daughters who were that age of the kids who were being arrested and mistreated and brutalized, if you will, by the police during that time when they were demonstrating in the streets. So he was not in favor of it. And something that I found out later from Lonnie King after I took over the paper, we had a nice visit about it. As you know, Lonnie King was at Morehouse and he was the leader of the student movement. He told me that CA had been pressured by advertisers to make the students stop. They said, and they threatened to pull their advertising if he didn't do it. Sounds familiar, like Casey Cagle today in Delta Airlines, right? So he said, CA called Lonnie in and said, "Can you cool it? Because one, you're going to get hurt. And if you get arrested, you're not going to be able to get a job, and you just need to let us take care of it because we're getting it done through the court system." They had gotten the Brown decision, they had gotten the one man, one vote decision on the county unit system done in the Supreme Court. So they felt like they were being effective, but it was taking a long time, and the students were having none of that. They wanted to have these barriers broken right now. So Lonnie said, no, we're not going to stop. And as a result, the advertisers did start pulling their ads from the Atlanta World. The other thing that happened is they got a lot of their reporters got picked off too. Paul Delaney was covering the civil rights movement. He got hired by the Dayton Daily News, which is one of the Cox properties. Cox is big owners of media here in Atlanta. So that was a kind of a beginning of the setback for the black press, and particularly for the Atlanta Daily World, because of the tensions that were there, both in terms of philosophy of approach to breaking down the barriers, and also the practicalities of desegregation, which meant there was kind of a brain drain. A lot of the folk who were working at the Atlanta World were getting hired by the white press. And so that was a big turning point for the Atlanta World, which led to the changes that happened by shutting down from every day to, a couple of times a week. So.
Let's talk a little bit about you're a daughter of the South.
Yeah.
You're in Atlanta. It's April 3rd, the day before 1968. We hear what becomes such a prophetic speech now 50 years later. Many of us look at that speech and said Dr. King was foreshadowing what would happen the very next day in Memphis.
Yeah.
Tell us, what was Alexis Scott doing at that point in that period? Where were you? And 50 years later, talk about looking in retrospect, because now you all have archive, you have moved from microfiche to digital. You have the history of what was happening in Atlanta, and we're really preparing for the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. Where were you and what were you doing, and what do you recall from a student perspective, and what do you recall now from a historical perspective? about that time.
Okay. At the time, I was a student. I was a college student. And I went to Barnard College, which is the women's college at Columbia University in New York City. And in April of 1967, I marched in the march against the war in Vietnam that Dr. King led and organized and spoke to. So I was in that march and heard him speak there. In 1968, when he was killed, I was at home on spring break. I was in my second year in college. And I had a couple of girlfriends who came home with me, and we were all just devastated by it. And I had not heard the speech the night before because we were doing whatever we were doing, but it was such a shock, and everybody was concerned that the city was going to blow up. But Atlanta did not. One thing happened. There was a store across the street from Morehouse at Fair and Ashby, which is now Lowry and Student Movement Way. They just looted it and burned it and told them to get out. It was owned by, it was probably, it wasn't a black person, so I'm not sure what his ethnicity, but it was probably a Jewish person because many Jewish merchants were in the black neighborhoods back in that time. And so that was the only incident. The students gathered in a rally. We talked about going, but my parents asked us not to go. They didn't want us to get injured or hurt. So we stayed in, but we paid close attention to the news. And then that weekend, I had to go back to school. So I remember watching the funeral on television in New York with a friend of mine.
Looking at the newspaper in this position, what stood out for you about the coverage? Because we looked at some of the historical documents just a couple of days ago.
Okay.
There's a lady who actually has the Daily World paper from that day, and it has magnificent pictures chronicling everything from the funeral to just some Dr. King stories.
Yeah, my dad took a lot of the pictures from the funeral, the procession and the people large gathering outside of the church and stuff. And so it was really amazing, but it was such a chaotic time that the papers never got sent off to be microfilmed. And finally, I found them in the plant down there on Auburn Avenue, back in a back room, and I said, here are the papers from April, because the whole month of April was missing, because evidently it just threw everybody off, And so I found them and sent them to them, and so they have now been microfilmed or digitized, and they are there now available online. But it was, everybody was just shocked, because it was the death of the king, and it was a lot of people wrote many wonderful stories and remembrances of him and tributes and stuff. And George Coleman was the editor at the time, and he, was very, very devastated by this act. The thing was true is that my dad and Martin Luther King Jr. had the same birthday, but 7 years apart. My dad was older, or maybe 6 years apart. I think he was born in 39. My dad was born in he was 39 when he died. He was born in 29. My dad was born in 23. And so they often talked on Auburn Avenue from time to time. So they were both kind of, my dad tended towards nonviolence, but he had been drafted into the Army in World War II. And he ended up being a photographer with his unit and captured the liberation of one of the concentration camps. So that he was 22 at that time, and he saw the devastation there, and he ascribed to the same principle as the nonviolent situation, because as Andy Young often says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leaves everybody blind and toothless, and so we can't go that route. And he comes back to the nonviolence thing, and that sort of rang true for my dad as well, because he had seen the total inhumanity that comes from genocide or attempted.
Let's kind of fast forward, and as we draw to a wrap up, you would eventually take over the paper.
Yeah.
Still in the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, you would come to know Coretta Scott King very intimately and very personally.
Yeah, she was a real fan of the newspaper, which I didn't really know until I got there. Maybe she was a fan of my taking over the newspaper because of the tradition that she had followed, establishing the King Center and taking on the mantle of leading the movement in her husband's stead. So after I got there, she would call me on a regular basis and tell me what she liked and tell me did I know this was happening or something or another. And so I was very honored that she was a supporter and, a source, if you will, for some of our news coverage. So that was it was a very wonderful feeling to feel that community support that we had, because I had been at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 18 years and Cox Enterprises for 4 years as a director of diversity, where my job was to get more people of color, more women into management throughout the whole Cox network. So it was a pretty significant job, and it was a really tough decision for me to leave it because I felt, I could see the impact that I could have broadly, but I also felt the call to come back and help with the family business. My cousin Portia was there, and her father was 89 when I took over. He was no longer physically able to come down to the paper, and he was instructing Portia on how to do things. She had never been on the business side. She'd only been on the journalism side. So that was where the need was on how we strengthen the business side. And because of my experiences at the Journal-Constitution, I was on the executive committee for 7 years as the VP Community Affairs. And the Cox kind of management style was team. So every week we met, and circulation, advertising, production, administration, human resources, whatever else they got, we all reported in, including me, and we were encouraged to mind each other's business. So when the time came for me to go to the paper, Portia called and said, we really need some help because my mother's no longer to help, and my dad is really frail, so we really need some help. And I think she really wanted me to send her money, but I didn't want to do that. And my dad, my own father, had worked there his entire life, and he had died 5 years before, in 1992. I always thought he would take over, and I'd be proud of him, and I could do my thing, he could do his. But it didn't work out that way. And so after she called, I said, well, I've really got to figure this out, whether I'm going to leave here and go there. And it took a while, but I decided that I needed to respond to the family call, and that's what I did.
The most interesting, the most, the interview or the coverage that you will never forget, what story was it?
I think it was Wayne Williams. He called me after, I got down there as publisher, and he said, I need you to come down here, because his father had been a photographer for the Atlanta World back in the 70s, and so, he knew my family knew his dad, and I knew his father. His father took pictures at my first wedding or my second wedding, one of them. Must have been my second one. Yeah, he took pictures in 1974 when I got married. So, I was familiar with him, he's familiar with me. And he said, I need y'all to come down here because I need to tell my story, because I need to get out of here because I didn't do it. So I was like, okay. And I wasn't sure where he was on it or not. I said, but we need to go down there and interview him. So we went down. I went, at the time I had recruited Chet Fuller to come work at the Atlanta World. He had retired from the AJC as well. And Erin Haynes, who's now a big-time AP reporter on race issues up in Philadelphia, she's based. And she was a reporter at the World at the time. And Wendell Scott, who's my cousin, he went down as our photographer. So we all went traveling down to Reidsville, and we sat with him for an hour or so, and he gave us a story, and he said, we're really trying to get this DNA evidence, and we're going to get this thing reopened. And we ran the story, and the whole Atlanta media just jumped right on it. And so we made, news happen in a way that hadn't happened in a long time. And so that was quite a memorable thing. And unfortunately, not much came of it because he just really didn't have the resources, or maybe even he actually did do these things, who knows. But it never developed to anyone getting the actual DNA evidence produced.
Beyond newspaper, Georgia Gang, which you have had a good run, a long run, still continues doing Georgia Gang.
Still going on. I got invited to be a fill-in for the Georgia Gang back in, I guess, about 16 years ago. And I did that, and at the time they had 5 people on the panel. We now have only 4. And so when they got cut back to 4, I made the the inclusion, I didn't get cut because I was the liberal voice on the panel. Everybody else is a little bit more to my right, but even Jeff, who was there for a long time, he was a little bit more conservative than I even, but he usually was on the right side when it came down to racial issues and gender issues. But sometimes on the business stuff, you know, I was like, come on, Jeff, you can't say that. But, you know, they call Dick Williams, who's the host of the Georgia Gang, called me the tax chair because I'm ready to raise the taxes. Whenever we need to do something, let's do it. But, you know, that's not entirely true, but I don't like the regressive tax, sales tax, but I prefer to have people be taxed who have money to pay them. But it's been an interesting run for sure, and I'm still doing it. And my goal right now that I'm working on is writing the family story to get these down. My story, because I broke some barriers going up in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution too, and, you know, my grandfather's story, my father's story from the war, and all that. I'm also working, my name is now on a screenplay about a film about my dad's experiences in World War II, and we've created a narrative film, a feature-length film, not a documentary. So we're trying to get that done, produced too.
Alexis Scott, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We appreciate you. Wonderful story, wonderful history.
Thank you.
Final question. Looking back over the newspaper, your family history, everything that leads us up to this very moment, describe the experience from your own standpoint, from your own perspective.
It's been wonderful and awful and amazing. And I feel so privileged to be a part of the family that I grew up in. I chose well.
Bless you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it's been a real interview with a real history maker. And so we thank you for watching. We thank you for your time again.
Thank you.
All right.